Hey guys, tonight we are going to get sick. Don't worry, not for real. We're going to imagine ourselves into a time when a simple cough or a mild fever wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential life or death crisis. A time before antibiotics, before sterile operating rooms, before you could just Google your symptoms and convince yourself you have a rare tropical disease. No, we're going somewhere a bit more rustic. You might not make it through the first day, but the story is worth it. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where we're all tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight. It's not a dramatic, thunderous downpour, but a miserable, persistent drizzle that seems to seep through the very walls of your small timber-framed house. The air inside is thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint, lingering aroma of last night's stew. You're huddled under a coarse, scratchy blanket, and every so often, a shudder runs through you that has nothing to do with the cold. It starts deep in your chest, a tickle, then a rumble, and finally, a hacking cough that leaves your ribs aching and your head swimming. This has been going on for a week. At first, it was just a nuisance. Your spouse brewed you a tea from dried thyme and honey, a remedy passed down through generations. It soothed your throat for a little while, but the cough always came back, meaner than before. Then came the fever, a slow, creeping heat that makes your thoughts feel fuzzy and your dreams unsettling. You've been trying to sweat it out under a pile of every blanket you own, but it only leaves you feeling weak and drenched. Around you, life goes on, but with a new, anxious rhythm. Your family speaks in hushed tones. Every cough you make is met with a shared, worried glance. This is how it starts, isn't it? Everyone knows someone, a cousin, a neighbor, a friend from the market who started with a simple chest cold and was gone within a month. There are no names for it yet, not really. No pneumonia or bronchitis. It's just a bad lung, a chest fever, a sign that the delicate balance inside your body has gone terribly wrong. The prevailing medical wisdom of your time, the super advanced, cutting-edge science, is the theory of the four humours. The idea is that your body is a container for four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is the perfect balance of these four. Sickness, that's just one of them getting out of whack. A cough and a fever, clearly you have an excess of phlegm, a humour associated with water and winter. It's cold and wet, just like the miserable weather outside. It all makes a strange kind of sense. The treatment, therefore, should be something that introduces heat and dryness back into your system. But what the village-wise woman suggested, a poultice of mustard seed and pig fat, which you dutifully strapped to your chest. It just made you smell like a sad, greasy sausage and did nothing for the cough. Your uncle, with the confidence of a man who has been wrong about many things in his life, insisted you just needed to drink more ale to flush the sickness out. That just made your head ache even more. The desperation is a physical presence in the room now. It hangs in the air heavier than the wood smoke. You're not getting better. The home remedies, the generational wisdom, it's all failing. Historical records from this period are filled with such stories, often ending abruptly, and historians still debate the exact level of trust people placed in formal medicine versus folk remedies. Was their faith and tradition absolute, or was it simply the first, cheapest line of defense in a world where professional help was a terrifying and expensive gamble for you, sitting here, shivering? The folk remedies have run their course. It's time to seek out the only other option available to a person of your modest means. Not the university-trained physician HES or the local lord and speaks mostly in Latin anyway. No, you need someone more practical. Someone whose shop smells of 1,000 strange and exotic things. Someone who might actually have a solution. So, the decision is made. It's a gamble, but staying here, fading away under a scratchy blanket, is a certainty. You push yourself up, your joints protesting with a dull ache. Your spouse helps you into your thickest cloak and a pair of worn leather shoes. The moment you step outside, the damp cold hits you like a physical blow, and you're immediately grateful for the extra layer. The street is less a street and more a shallow river of mud, rutted and churned by cart wheels and the constant passage of feet. The air smells of wet earth, livestock, and the cloying odor from the tanner's workshop down the lane. Every step is a calculated effort, a small victory against the weakness in your limbs. You keep your head down, pulling the hood of your cloak forward to shield your face from the drizzle and the curious glances of your neighbors. In a small community like this, a trip to the apothecary is public knowledge before you've even reached his door. It's an unspoken announcement that things have gone from bad to worse. You can feel their eyes on you, a mixture of pity, fear, and perhaps a little bit of morbid curiosity. You are now a walking, coughing reminder of every owner's own fragility. Finally, you see it. The apothecary's shop. It's squeezed between a boisterous bakery, from which the warm, comforting smell of bread seems to mock your own misery, and a cobbler's dark workshop. There's a painted sign hanging above the door, a carving of a mortar and pestle, the universal symbol of his trade. You pause for a moment, gathering your strength and your courage, before pushing the heavy wooden door open. A small bell jingles somewhere in the gloom, announcing your arrival. The air inside is a shock to the system. It's a dense, almost tangible cloud of 100 different smells, all competing for attention. There's the sweet, cloying scent of dried herbs like lavender and chamomile, the sharp, spicy notes of cloves and something like cinnamon, and a dusty, earthy smell that reminds you of a long-closed cellar. Underneath it all is a faint, musky, animal odor that you can't quite place, and it's not entirely pleasant. Your eyes, accustomed to the grey light outside, struggle to adjust to the dim interior. The shop is a cavern of chaotic wonders. Shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, crammed with jars, pots, and wooden boxes of every conceivable size. Some are elegant ceramic, others are simple green or brown glass, and a few are just rough-hewn wood. Through the gloom, you can make out handwritten labels in a spidry script, most of which you can tread. Hanging from the ceiling beams are bunches of dried herbs, what looks like a desiccated frog, and a string of what might be vertebrae. This is the domain of the apothecary, a figure who occupied a unique space in your world, part pharmacist, part grocer of exotic goods, and part frontline diagnostician. He wasn't a university-trained physician, but for most people, he was the only medical expert they would ever meet. From behind a high wooden counter at the back of the shop, a man emerges, 8 years older, with a fringe of grey hair and a pair of small, round spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His fingers are stained with a brownish residue, and his apron has seen better decades. He looks at you not with warmth, but with the practiced, assessing eye of a craftsman examining a piece of faulty material. "A bad cough," he says. It's not a question. Your ragged breathing and the occasional shuddering hack are all the diagnosis he needs. You nod, too breathless to speak much. He beckons you closer. His examination is brief and unavingling impersonal. He peers at your tongue, feels your forehead with the back of his hand, and listens to your chest, his ear pressed against the damp wool of your cloak. He asks a few questions in a low, gravelly voice, about the phlegm, about your diet. He nods slowly, his expression unchanging. The humors are in discord, he announces, confirming what you already suspected. Too much cold and wet. We need to restore the balance. Dry you out. Introduce some heat. He turns his back on you and begins to scan his crowded shelves. His fingers trace along the rows of jars. Past things you can vaguely identify: powdered ginger, rosy hips, licorice root. He passes over a stranger item. Your stomach is labeled fox lungs, a well-known, if gruesome, folk remedy for breathing ailments. Historians still debate just how much faith the apothecaries themselves placed in these more bizarre ingredients. Were they true believers in the doctrine that like cures like, or were they just savvy businessmen who understood that a dose of the exotic and the macabrous old better than simple herbs? The apothecary's hand hesitates, then stops. He reaches up to a high shelf, a place of honor, it seems, reserved for his most potent and, you assume, most expensive remedies. He carefully takes down a dark, earthenware pot, sealed with a wax stopper and a piece of twine. It feels significant, important. This isn't the common stuff. This is for when the thyme tea and mustard poultices have failed. This is for when you're standing at the edge. He places the earthenware pot on the counter with a quiet, deliberate thud. The sound seems to echo in the small, cluttered shop. The pot itself is unremarkable, dark, heavy, and cool to the touch. But it feels like the centerpiece of the room now, a focal point for all your desperate hopes. The apothecary's stained fingers drum a soft, rhythmic beat on the wooden counter beside it, a thoughtful little tap-tap that only adds to the tension. He looks from the pot to you, then back to the pot, his spectacles glinting in the single beam of dusty light filtering through a high, grimy window. This, he says, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is for serious afflictions. He lets the weight of that statement hang in the air for a moment. HES a good salesman, you have to give him that. HES not just selling a remedy, HES selling gravitas, a sense of ancient and powerful knowledge. With a practiced motion, he picks at the wax seal with a small sharp knife. The seal cracks with a satisfying snap, and he carefully unwinds the twine. He pulls out the stopper, and a peculiar smell wafts out, joining the cacophony of odors already filling the shop. It's a strange scent, unlike anything else on his shelves. It's dusty, yes, profoundly so, like air from a tomb that has been sealed for centuries. But there's also a hint of something else, something vaguely sweet and resinous, like old wooden spices, and a faint, almost imperceptible undertone that is strangely savory. It's a smell that doesn't belong in a pharmacy. He tilts the pot towards you. Inside you see a coarse dark brown powder. It's not uniform, you can see little flecks of lighter and darker material, some bits that look fibrous, almost like ground up bark, and other, harder looking granules. It looks less like medicine and more like something you'd sweep up from the floor of a spice warehouse. Mamia, he says, pronouncing the word with a certain reverence. Mamia, it sounds foreign, exotic, powerful. You've heard the name before in hushed whispers at the market or in boastful tales from travelers. It's a legendary substance, a panacea, a cure-all whisper to be capable of healing everything from a simple headache to the dreaded plague. It's the kind of thing you hear about, but never expect to see, let alone afford. Seeing it here on this dusty counter in your own small town feels surreal. From the land of the pharaohs, the apothecary continues, warming to his subject. He leans in closer, his voice a low rumble. From Egypt, the bodies of their ancient kings and queens, preserved for thousands of years. They were wrapped in rare spices and soaked in bitumen, the black pitch that bubbles up from the earth, that is the source of its power. He gestures for a small set of brass-balanced scales, the kind used for weighing precious goods. He carefully tips a small amount of the brown powder onto one of the scales' pans. It's a minuscule amount, barely a spoonful, but he handles it with the care of a jeweler handling diamonds. This is where you learn another tidbit of history, the bizarre economy of the dead. The price of mamia fluctuated wildly depending on its perceived quality. Was it from a well-preserved Ptolemaic mummy, or a more common, Roman-era one? Was it rich in that desirable black, resinous material? Some merchants even sold it based on the body part. It was supposedly ground from powdered skull for head ailments, for instance. A historical claim that, thankfully for you in this moment, your apothecary doesn't seem to be making. You watch, mesmerized, as he balances the powder against a set of tiny, intricate weights. The cost will be steep. You know this. It will likely cost you a week's wages, maybe more. It's a choice between the looming rent and this dark, dusty hope in a pot. But then another cough tears through you, a deep, rattling spasm that leaves you gasping for breath, and the choice seems to make itself. It contains the life force of the ancients, the apothecary explains as he carefully scrapes the weighed powder into a small twist of paper. The very substance that cheated death for millennia. When you take it, that power transfers to you. It purifies the blood, dries the excess phlegm, and restores the vital heat to your body. The logic is simple, elegant, and in this pre-scientific world, utterly compelling. If something can preserve a body from decay for 3,000 years, surely a small dose of it can preserve a living body from a mere chest cold for another week. It makes a kind of poetic sense. He folds the paper packet with neat, precise creases and pushes it across the counter toward you. Your hand trembles slightly as you reach for it. It feels impossibly light, this little packet that carries so much weight, the weight of your hope, the weight of your family's meager savings, and the strange, unsettling weight of history itself. You are holding, right there in your hand, a tiny, pulverized piece of a very, very old person. You hand over the coins with a heavy heart. They're cool and solid in your palm one moment, and gone the next, swept into a wooden drawer by the apothecary's practiced hand. The transaction feels fine or irreversible. You clutch the small paper packet, its contents feeling impossibly light and fragile, and make your way back out into the dreary afternoon. The journey home is a blur. The mud, the drizzle, the curious stares of your neighbors, none of it registers. Your entire focus is on the little packet held tight in your hand, a tiny, precious shield against the gnawing fear in your chest. Back in the smoky warmth of your house, the atmosphere is thick with anticipation. Your spouse watches with wide, hopeful eyes as you unwrap the paper. The dark brown powder sits in the crease, looking just as strange and inert as it did in the apothecary's shop. Now comes the moment of truth. How does one consume a 3,000-year-old Egyptian noble? The apothecary had given you simple instructions: mix it with a little warm wine or ale. The alcohol would activate its properties, HED claimed, and help carry the healing power through your body. A mug of ale, slightly warmed by the fire. You carefully tip the powder in. It doesn't dissolve so much as swirl, creating a murky, gritty suspension in the dark liquid. It looks unappetizing. You hesitate. The smell is stronger now, that dusty, faintly sweet, and unsettling rice-savory aroma. You think of the apothecary's words from the land of the pharaohs. And this is where your journey truly begins, not just into recovery, you hope, but into one of history's most bizarre and long-lived medical misunderstandings. You are about to partake in a tradition that, at this point, has already been going on in Europe for a couple of hundred years and will continue for a couple of hundred more. You are not an outlier, you are the norm. Kings and popes, merchants and peasants, they are all, at one time or another, turning to this very remedy. You close your eyes, say a silent prayer to whom? You are not entirely sure, perhaps to your god, perhaps to the long-dead Egyptian in your cup, and you drink. The texture is the first thing you notice. It's gritty. Tiny, hard particles scrape against your tongue and teeth. The taste is complex and not entirely unpleasant. There's the familiar flavor of the ale, but underneath it, there's an earthy, mineral taste mixed with a hint of something resinous and faintly spicy. It's the taste of immense, unknowable age. As you swallow, you try to focus on the apothecary's promise. You imagine this ancient substance traveling down into your chest, a wave of warmth and dryness pushing back the cold, damp sickness. You envision it seeking out the discord in your humors and setting it right, a tiny, pulverized ghost fighting on your behalf. You drain the cup. A fine, dark sediment remains at the bottom. You stare at it for a moment. Who were you? A priest of Amun-Ra, a chariot builder from Thebes, a noblewoman who loved to sail on the Nile? Did you have a family who mourned you, who carefully prepared your body for a journey into the afterlife, never imagining, in their wildest dreams, that your final destination would be the stomach of a sick person in a rainy, dreary land thousands of miles and thousands of miles and thousands of years away? This is the core of the belief system you've just bought into. The logic, as explained to you, is one of sympathetic magic. The ancient Egyptians, through their mysterious arts of mummification, had seemingly conquered death, or at least its visible manifestation, decay. Their bodies remained intact, eternal. Therefore, the substance responsible for this preservation must contain a powerful life-preserving essence. It's a classic example of what anthropologists call contagious magic, the idea that things that were once in contact continue to influence each other. By consuming a part of the mummy, you are hoping its quality of permanence will magically transfer to you. You lean back, pulling the scratchy blanket up to your chin. There's nothing to do now but wait. Wait and hope. You don't know it, but the powder you just swallowed is a cocktail of history. It could contain traces of linen bandages, natrons alt used for desiccation, aromatic resins like myrrh and frankincense, cedarwood oil, and of course, the desiccated human tissue itself. Historians are still trying to piece together the exact recipes for mummification from different Egyptian dynasties, and they varied considerably. So, the medicine you just took was never a standardized product. Each dose was a unique, and frankly gruesome, historical artifact. You close your eyes. The warmth of the ale spreads through your limbs, and for the first time in days, a sliver of hope cuts through the fog of your fever. Maybe, just maybe, this strange, ancient dust will work. Maybe the pharaohs really did hold the secret to cheating death. As you lie there, drifting in a slightly gritty, ale-induced haze, let's rewind. Let's leave your damp, hopeful bedside for a moment and travel back even further in time, to the origin of this whole strange affair. Because you didn't just swallow a piece of a person, you swallowed a misunderstanding. A colossal, centuries-spanning, linguistic blunder. It all started with a single word, Mumaya. Picture a sun-baked landscape radically different from your drizzly corner of the world. We're in ancient Persia or perhaps Arabia. The word Mumaya comes from the Persian word mum, which means wax. Originally, Mumaya referred to a specific, naturally occurring substance, bitumen or asphalt. It's that black, sticky, tar-like goo that sometimes seeps out of the ground in oil-rich areas, particularly from a place known as the Mummy Mountain in Persia. This natural bitumen was a peculiar substance. It was gooey and black, and people noticed it had remarkable preservative qualities. They used it as a sealant to mortar, and crucially, as a medicine. Ancient physicians, like the famous Greek Diacorsized, wrote about the medicinal properties of this Persian bitumen. They prescribed it, often mixed with other ingredients, for a whole range of ailments, fractures, bruises, skin conditions, and internal troubles. It was seen as a powerful agent for sealing wounds and preventing putrefaction. So far, so good. A bit weird, maybe, to be eating tar, but no actual mummies are involved. So where did the wires get crossed? The confusion began with the ancient Egyptians. When later visitors, particularly Greeks and Romans, began exploring the ancient tombs of Egypt, they saw the bodies of the dead, wrapped in linen and looking strangely preserved. They noticed that many of these bodies were coated or filled with a dark, black, resinous substance that looked an awful lot like that medicinal bitumen. They made a logical leap, an assumption that turned out to be mostly wrong. They assumed that the secret to Egyptian mummification was this liberal application of bitumen. In reality, while some later period mummies, especially from the Greco-Roman era, did use bitumen as a cheap and effective preservative, it wasn't the primary ingredient for the classic pharaonic mummifications. The dark, blackened appearance of many mummies was actually the result of the complex chemical reactions of resins, oils, and the natural decay process over millennia, not a tar bath. But the visual similarity was undeniable. The bodies looked like they were covered in mumaya. The word mumaya was now applied to two different things: the original mineral pitch and the blackened, preserved bodies from Egyptian tombs. This is where the real trouble starts. Fast forward to the medieval period. The great medical texts of the ancient Greek and Persian worlds are being translated into Arabic by brilliant scholars in places like Baghdad. These translators are working with texts that praise the healing virtues of mumaya. One of the most influential was the Persian physician Arhazes. He wrote extensively about the powers of this substance for healing bruises and wounds. But when these Arabic texts were, in turn, translated into Latin for a European audience, a critical ambiguity crept in. The Latin word became mumia, but which mumia did the texts mean? The original, geological bitumen, or the new, corpse-based substance that now shared its name? This is a point that historians still argue about. Was it a genuine, good faith confusion, or did some enterprising merchants intentionally conflate the two to create a new, more exotic market? Imagine a translator in Toledo or Sicily, scratching his head. The text says mumia is a powerful medicine, and HES heard tales from travelers about the incredible preserved bodies in Egypt, which are also called mumia. The lines blur. Slowly, insidiously, the meaning shifted. The logic went something like this: the ancient texts say mumia is a powerful medicine. The bodies from Egypt are called mumia. Therefore, the bodies from Egypt are the powerful medicine the ancients were talking about. In fact, they must be even more powerful. The original bitumen just preserved things. This new mummy was taken from bodies that had themselves been preserved, adding an extra layer of magical potency. It was an upgrade. And just like that, a medicine cabinet staple transformed from a mineral to a mortal. This wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual creep, a slow-motion game of telephone played out over centuries and across cultures. A fascinating, if slightly morbid, little footnote to this is the existence of piss asphalt, another natural bitumen that the ancient Greeks believed was solidified urine from a lynx. Thankfully for everyone, that particular misconception didn't catch on as a mainstream medical trend, but it shows you the kind of bizarre beliefs that were floating around. So as you lie in your bed, feeling the ale and the ancient dust settle in your stomach, you are the living embodiment of this epic translation error. The cure you've placed your faith in was born from a case of mistaken identity. You think you're consuming the secret of the pharaohs, but you're really just at the tail end of a very long, very strange linguistic mixer. Let's stay with that thought for a moment, the once whirling in your feverish mind. The apothecary's logic seemed so simple, so intuitive. A substance that preserves the dead must surely preserve the living. As you lie there, this idea doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like profound, unassailable wisdom. And you're not alone. This was just a folksy belief you picked up from a village quack. This was a cornerstone of respectable, mainstream medical theory for centuries. To understand why, you have to put on the mindset of a person from this era. Your understanding of the human body is, to put it mildly, a bit abstract. You don't know about cells or germs or viruses. The world inside you is a mysterious landscape governed by the four humors, those vital fluids we talked about. Health is harmony, sickness is discord. But there's another, deeper belief at play, the idea of a vital force or life essence. This was a philosophical and medical concept suggesting that living things were animated by a kind of spiritual energy. The ancient Egyptians and their magnificent, enduring monuments and their impossibly preserved dead seem to have mastered this life force. Their mummies weren't just seen as dead bodies. They were viewed as vessels that had somehow trapped or retained a measure of that vital essence over millennia. They hadn't just resisted decay, they had held onto a spark of their original animation. Consuming them was just about ingesting old spices and salts. It was about absorbing that trapped life force. It was a spiritual top-up, a way to bolster your own flagging vital energy with a dose from a long dead, but seemingly eternal source. This belief system produced some truly wild theories. One prominent idea, championed by the larger-than-life Renaissance physician Paracelsus, was that all things contained a signature, or a hidden virtue, that hinted at their purpose. A plant with a heart-shaped leaf might be good for the heart, for example. This was the doctrine of signatures. By this logic, a mummy, which visually represented a triumph over mortality, was the ultimate signature for longevity and healing. Its very existence was a sign from God or nature about its medicinal purpose. The medical logic became a self-reinforcing loop of absurdity. Why was mummy good for broken bones? Because it came from bodies that had remained whole for ages. Why was it good for staunching blood? Because the mummies themselves, by definition, no longer bled. Why was it prescribed for epilepsy, a mysterious ailment often attributed to spiritual causes? Because it contained the spirit or essence of a being who was now at peace, free from worldly afflictions. For every ailment, a plausible, if entirely fantastical, explanation could be concocted. Now let's talk about the bitumen again, the innocent bystander in this whole mix-up. Even as the focus shifted to corpses, the perceived importance of bitumen lingered. For a long time, the most sought-after mummy was that which was shiny, black, and resinous, believing it to be richest in the original, magical pitch. This created a hierarchy of dead bodies. A mummy that was dry brown and crumbly was considered lower grade. The premium stuff was dark and sticky. This led to a rather ghoulish quality assessment process. One 16th century medical text advises that the best mummy should have a strong, pitch-like smell and should not be too crumbly. In essence, it was a guide on how to pick the juiciest corpse. Here's a bizarre little side note for you: this obsession with preservation as a cure wasn't entirely unique to Egyptian mummies. There was another, even stranger, legendary substance known as a male-ified man. The story, mentioned in Chinese medical texts, described a gruesome process where an elderly man would voluntarily give up his life to become a medicine. He would eat nothing but honey until his sweat and feces were honey, and upon death, his body would be submerged in a stone sarcophagus full of honey for a century. The resulting confection, a human candy, essentially was said to be an almost mythical cure for broken limbs. Historians are still debating whether this was a real, if exceedingly rare, practice or just a dark medical fable, but it speaks to the same core idea: consuming a perfectly preserved human body could impart incredible healing properties. So as you lie there, hoping for the best, you are participating in a system of logic that is, to our modern eyes, completely backward. We see a mummy and think a successful preservation of the dead. You, and the most learned physicians of your time, would see it and think a powerful medicine for the living. The mummy wasn't an endpoint, it was an ingredient. Its purpose wasn't to lie peacefully in a tomb for eternity. Its ultimate destiny, its highest calling, was to be ground up and stirred into a cup of ale to cure your cough. It's a profound shift in perspective, and it's the reason why this strange practice wasn't just a fringe superstition but a respectable medical tradition for an astonishingly long time. The ale, the warmth of the fire, and perhaps even the sheer power of belief are starting to have an effect. Your shivering subsides and your breathing feels a fraction easier. As you drift on the edge of sleep, your mind isn't just on your own body, but on the journey that this strange medicine took to reach you. It was just a physical journey across the sea, it was a journey of knowledge, a long and twisted path of translation and interpretation that carried it from the libraries of Baghdad to your local apothecary's shelf. The story of Mummies' rise in Europe is a story about the transmission of ideas. During the early Middle Ages in Europe, much of the medical knowledge of the ancient Greeks, like Galen and Hippocrates, was lost or inaccessible. It was the Islamic Golden Age that became the great library of the ancient world. Scholars and centers of learning like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba diligently collected, translated, and expanded upon these ancient texts. It was here, in the hands of brilliant Persian and Arab physicians like Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in the West, and Muhammad ibn Akarivi al-Razi al-Hazes, that the medicinal use of Mumaya, still mostly meaning bitumen at this point, was codified and celebrated. Their encyclopedic works, like Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, became the definitive medical textbooks for centuries, not just in the Islamic world, but eventually in Europe as well. These books were treasure troves of medical knowledge, covering everything from surgery and anatomy to pharmacology, and within their pages, Mumaya was listed as a standard, effective remedy. The crucial handoff happened in places like Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures mingled. Starting around the 11th and 12th centuries, a massive translation movement began. European scholars, hungry for the advanced knowledge of the Arab world, flocked to these cultural crossroads. A key figure was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who traveled to Toledo in Spain and dedicated his life to translating Arabic texts into Latin. He is credited with translating Arabic texts into Latin, including Avicenna's canon. This is the moment where the knowledge, and the crucial misunderstanding, was imported directly into the heart of European thought. When Gerard translated the entry for Mumaya, the ambiguity came with it. By this time, the term was already being used to refer to both bitumen and the exhumed Egyptian bodies. The Latin texts now contained the authoritative stamp of the great Avicenna, recommending a substance called Mumia. Imagine you are a European physician in the 13th century. You've just gotten your hands on a fresh Latin translation of the canon. It's the most advanced medical text you've ever seen. You read about this wonder drug, Mumia. At the same time, traders from Venice and Genoa are starting to bring back strange, exotic goods from their travels to the east, to Egypt and the Levant. Among their cargo of spices and silks are unsettling-looking lumps of black, resinous material, and sometimes whole, bandaged limbs. They call it Mumia. The connection was immediate and irresistible. The legendary medicine from the ancient books was now, miraculously, available for purchase. This is where the academic theory, born of a translation error, met the grubby reality of commerce. The demand was instant, and it was just for medicine. A little-known fact is that one of the earliest uses for imported mummy material in Europe wasn't for consumption, but as a magical ingredient. Before it was a mainstream medicine, it was a component in alchemy and sorcery, believed to hold potent mystical powers. Historians are still debating which came first. Did the magical use popularize the substance, which then lead to its medical adoption, or did the medical texts give it the credibility it needed to become a popular magical ingredient? It was likely a bit of both, a feedback loop of the mystical and the medicinal. The knowledge didn't just stay in dusty libraries. It spread. As universities began to pop up across Europe, the translated works of Avicenne and Arhazes became the core curriculum. So for generations, every university-trained doctor in Europe was taught, as a matter of scientific fact, that mumia was a legitimate and effective medicine. They in turn passed this knowledge down to the apothecaries who trained under them. The mistake wasn't just made once, it was printed in books, taught in lecture halls, and prescribed on parchment. So the slightly hazy sense of relief you're feeling right now is underwritten by this immense, centuries-long journey of knowledge, from a Persian mountain to a Greek physician's scroll to a Baghdad library, through a translator's quill in Spain, into a Venetian merchant's cargo hold, and finally to your apothecary's dusty pot. It's a testament to how ideas, even wrong ones, can acquire a life of their own, traveling across empires and enduring for centuries, especially when they promise something everyone desperately wants a cure. The worst of the coughing fit has passed and a fragile peace settles over you. You might not be cured, but you feel better. Or at least you have hope, which is its own kind of medicine. As you rest, let's pull the lens back from your small room and look out across the continent. Because the little drama unfolding in your house is being repeated in millions of homes, in grand palaces, and in bustling city hospitals all across Europe. The use of mumia was a fringe practice, continent-wide phenomenon, a medical craze that lasted for more than 500 years. By the 16th century, mumia was a staple. It was listed in official pharmacopoeias, the standard reference books for apothecaries and physicians. You could walk into a pharmacy in London, Paris, or Berlin and expect to find it on the shelf, just as you'd expect to find chamomile or cloves. It had become a household remedy, the historical equivalent of having a bottle of aspirin in your medicine cabinet. People took it for everything. Headaches, stomach aches, coughs like yours, bruises, broken bones, trembling, paralysis, and most optimistically of all, the plague. It was the ultimate panacea, the Swiss Army knife of pre-modern medicine. The demand was staggering, and it was just the sick and desperate. Mumia became a kind of bizarre health supplement for the wealthy. The rich would take a small amount daily as a preventative, a way to ward off illness and maintain their vigor. It was the go-to prescription for the elite. King Francis I of France, a towering figure of the Renaissance, was said to never travel anywhere without a pouch of mumia mixed with rhubarb, always on hand in case of a fall or accident. It was his personal emergency medical kit. This popularity trickled down through every layer of society. While the king might be getting the premium, grade A furrow powder, a common person like you would be getting a more affordable, but still potent, version from the local apothecary. The belief in its efficacy was nearly universal. In a world with few effective medicines, the psychological comfort of taking something so ancient and revered cannot be overstated. When the doctor gave you mumia, you knew he was taking your illness seriously. He was bringing out the big guns. The trade was incredibly lucrative. One historical tidbit that highlights the scale of this is that for a time, mumia was treated as a standard commodity, like pepper or cinnamon. It was subject to customs duties and taxes. Records from the port of Alexandria in the 15th and 16th centuries show huge quantities of it being shipped out, destined for the pharmacies of Europe. It was just another spice from the East, albeit a uniquely human one. Of course, with such high demand and such a strange source, all sorts of myths and legends sprang up around it. People believed that the best mumia came from the bodies of people who had died violently and suddenly, as their life force was thought to be more potently trapped in their remains. The mummies of young people, or even children, were considered particularly valuable for the same reason. This is a dark and unsettling corner of the trade. And it's a topic historians still grapple with: how much of this was just fanciful storytelling, and how much did it reflect the grim reality of what traders were actually seeking out in the tombs of Egypt. It's hard to know for sure. The craze seeped into the culture. Mumia appeared in literature and plays. In Shakespeare's Othello, the precious handkerchief that drives the plot to its tragic conclusion was dyed using mummy. Desdemona explains, "It was dyed in mummy which the skillful conserved of maidens' hearts." Shakespeare was tapping into a commonplace belief of his audience that Mumia was a substance of immense power, tied to magic, love, and life itself. The fact that he could use the word mummy in this context without needing to explain it shows just how deeply embedded it was in the popular consciousness. So as you lie there, you are part of a vast, invisible brotherhood. The king in his castle, the merchant in his counting house, the soldier on the battlefield, they are all your fellow patients, all placing their faith in the same powder dust from a distant land. This shared belief, however misguided, was a powerful social glue. It was a common thread running through a divided and chaotic continent. Everyone, from the highest to the lowest, was united by a common fear of death and a common, deeply weird, hope for a cure. Your little packet of dust isn't just a personal remedy, it's a ticket into the biggest, strangest medical club in European history. The fragile hope you've purchased is resting in your stomach, but its journey started thousands of miles away in the sun-scorched, silent landscapes of Egypt. The immense European demand for mumia didn't just magically conjure the supply. It launched a new, and rather grim, profession: the mummy hunter. These weren't archaeologists. They weren't scholars. They were rough, pragmatic entrepreneurs who saw the insatiable appetite of the European market and recognized a golden opportunity. The ancient dead of Egypt were no longer sacred relics, they were a cash crop, waiting to be harvested. So let's imagine you're not the patient anymore. Let's put you in the worn-out sandals of one of these prospectors at the height of the mummy rush, say, in the 16th or 17th century. You're not a local Egyptian, more likely a European adventurer, a down-on-his-luck merchant, or maybe a sailor who jumped ship in Alexandria, drawn by tales of quick riches. You've scraped together a small crew of local guides and laborers, men who know the desert and, more importantly, know the locations of the ancient necropolis, the cities of the dead. Your destination isn't the Grand Pyramids of Giza. Those are too obvious, too heavily guarded, and frankly, too much work to get into. You're looking for the softer targets, the sprawling, less monumental burial grounds scattered along the Nile, places like Saqqara or the vast cemeteries near Thebes. These places are honeycombed with tombs, thousands of them, ranging from the elaborate resting places of nobles to the simple pit graves of commoners. The work is hot, dirty, and dangerous. You spend your days under a relentless sun, the heat shimmering off the sand. Your local guide points to a spot that looks like nothing, just a patch of gravellands unlike any other. But he insists this is the place. Oral tradition, or perhaps the experience of his father and grandfather who did this same work, tells him a tomb lies beneath. And so the digging begins. Your crew works with simple tools, shovels, picks, and baskets to haul away the sand and rock. It's backbreaking labor. The entrance to a tomb is often just a vertical shaft, sometimes dozens of feet deep. There's a constant risk of caverns. The air is choked with dust that's been undisturbed for millennia. But the potential reward, after days of digging, a worker's shovel hits something that isn't rock. A hollow sound. They founded the stone slab or bricked-up doorway sealing the tomb. A new kind of energy fills the crew. The entrance is forced open with crabbers, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoing in the desert silence. And then, the first wave of air from the tomb washes over you. It's an unforgettable smell, indescribably ancient, dry, and dusty, with undertones of resin, dried linen, and the faint, unmistakable scent of the long dead. You light a torch or an oil lamp and descend into the darkness. The world of the sun is left into a silent, sacred space. Or it was a sacred space. Or it's a warehouse. The tomb might be a simple chamber or a complex of rooms. The walls could be covered in beautiful, vibrant paintings, scenes of the deceased's life and their journey into the afterlife. You might see images of gods you'd recognize, hieroglyphs you can trade. A historian or an artist would be transfixed. You are not. You are looking for the product. And there they are. Sarcophag, perhaps, or simple wooden coffins, or maybe just bodies wrapped in linen, laid out on shelves or stacked in niches. This is the moment of truth. A beautifully decorated sarcophagus is a good sign. It suggests a wealthy occupant, which means a potentially high-quality mummy inside. But it's also a lot of work to open. Sometimes, it's easier to bypass the fancy ones and look for the less protected, more accessible bodies. This is a point of contention for historians: how much of the mummy trade was supplied by real pharaonic era mummies versus those from the later, more numerous Greco-Roman and Coptic periods. The truth is, the hunters probably didn't care. A mummy was a mummy. Age and provenance were secondary to accessibility and preservation. A 3,000-year-old vizier was great, but if he was sealed in a granite sarcophagus, a 1,500-year-old merchant in a simple wooden box was a much better business proposition. One strange and little-known aspect of this trade was the legal grey area it occupied. For a long time, the Ottoman rulers of Egypt didn't have a specific policy against it. They saw it less as desecration and more as a peculiar form of quarrying. They were often happy to turn a blind eye, or more likely to tax the trade, taking their cut of the profits. So, for a period, this wasn't even a black market. It was a semi-legitimate, if grim, enterprise. Your little expedition might have even paid a local official for the rights to excavate a certain patch of desert. It was a ghoulish but structured business. Your torch flickers, casting long dancing shadows across the painted walls of the tomb. The air is still and heavy. Your crew, their initial excitement replaced by a grim, business-like focus, gets to work. There's no reverence here. No sense of awe for the ancient dead. This is a harvest. The goal is to extract the maximum amount of product as efficiently as possible. You watch as two of your men approach a large wooden coffin. Using a crowbar, they pry the lid open. The screech of old wood is the first sound the chamber has heard in 2,000 years. Inside, nestled in decaying linen, lies the mummy. It's not what you might imagine from a museum display. It's not a serene, golden masked king. More often than not, it's a dark, brittle-looking thing, swathed in stained and yellowed bandages, giving off that strange, dusty sweet smell. The processing begins on site. There's no point in shipping a whole, intact mummy if you can avoid it. They are bulky, heavy, and more likely to be damaged in transit. It's much more efficient to break them down into manageable pieces. Your men work quickly, pulling the body from its coffin and laying it on the sandy floor. The wrappings, which an archaeologist would spend weeks carefully removing, are ripped away in seconds. They are dry and brittle, tearing like old paper. Small amulets, scarabs, and KHS. Little figures of God stumble out from between the folds. Your men might pocket these, hoping to sell them separately. They are a small, personal bonus. Then comes the truly grim part. The body itself is dismembered. An axe or a heavy mallet is used to break the body apart. A torso might be hacked into several pieces. A head, considered particularly valuable by some apothecaries for treating headaches and mental ailments, is severed from the neck. Limbs are snapped at the joints. It's a brutal, assembly-line desecration. The sound of splintering ancient bone and brittle, desiccated flesh echoes in a vingworm in the small chamber. You oversee the operation, not with malice, but with the detached eye of a foreman. Is the material of good quality? Is it dark and resinous, the kind that fetches the best price, or is it dry and powdery, the discount variety? You might grab a piece of tissue and crumble it between your fingers or sniff it, assessing its aromatic profile. It's a grotesque parody of a spice merchant inspecting his wares. One of the strangest details from historical accounts of this process is the discovery of mummy wheat. Sometimes small caches of grain were found in tombs, placed there to provide sustenance for the deceased in the afterlife. A persistent myth arose that this ancient wheat, if planted, would grow. This led to a small, secondary market for mummy wheat, sold to gullible farmers and gardeners in Europe. Of course, as scientists later proved, grain that is thousands of years old is completely sterile and will not germinate. But the story was too good not to believe. It added another layer of mystique to the whole enterprise. As your crew works, you might find yourself in a moral grey area that historians still ponder. What did the local Egyptian laborers truly think of this work for many? It was just a job, a way to feed their families in a land with few opportunities. They lived atop a vast, buried treasure, and the strange foreigners were willing to pay good money for it. However, some accounts suggest a lingering sense of unease. There are tales of workers refusing to enter certain tombs, believed to be protected by powerful curses or inhabited by jinn spirits. It's hard to separate genuine belief from clever negotiation tactics to get higher pay for dangerous work. Were they truly afraid of the pharaoh's curse, or were they just trying to get a better deal from their European employer? The answer is probably a complex mix of both. Once the bodies are broken down, the pieces are stuffed into canvas sacks or wooden crates. Heads, limbs, torsos all jumbled together. The tomb, once a pristine and sacred space, is now a scene of chaos and destruction. Smashed coffins lie in splinters, linen wrappings are strewn across the floor, and the faint outline of where the bodies once lay is marked in the dust. You've taken what you came for. The rest is just debris. You and your crew haul the heavy sacks back up the shaft, into the blinding sunlight. The mission is a success. You haven't just disturbed the peace of the dead, you've shattered it. You've reduced priests, scribes, and nobles to a raw commodity. Their carefully planned journey to the afterlife has been brutally and permanently rerouted. With a final destination they could never have imagined, a pharmacy shelf in a cold, damp country far, far away. The sacks of human remains are loaded onto the backs of camels. Their weight is a satisfying testament to a profitable venture. Your small caravan begins the slow trek from the necropolis back towards the Nile, leaving the desecrated tombs to the silence of the desert. But the journey for this strange cargo has only just begun. What you've just harvested is now entering a complex and surprisingly well-organized supply chain, a transnational business built entirely on the dead. Your first stop is a larger town or city on the river, perhaps a place like Luxor or Syut. Here, you'll connect with the next link in the chain, the middleman. These are often local Egyptian or Levantine merchants who have established networks and, crucially, the right connections with port authorities. You sell your haul to them, probably by weight. They don't ask too many questions about where or how you got it, and you don't offer any details. Don't tell policy that keeps the entire industry running smoothly. In a dusty, sun-drenched warehouse, the real processing takes place. Your crude, hacked-up pieces are sorted and graded. This is where the true art of the mummy merchant comes into play. Is this a prime piece, rich with dark resin that gets set aside for a special shipment? Is it a drier, more brittle piece that will be sold at a lower price? Sometimes, different pieces are blended together, much like a coffee merchant blends beans, to create a consistent house blend of mummy. The body parts are then prepared for their long sea voyage. They are packed tightly into barrels or crates, often with sawdust or straw to absorb any lingering moisture and prevent rattling. The packing lists for these shipments, some of which have survived in historical archives, make for surreal reading. A manifest might list 5 barrels of cloves, 10 bolts of silk, and 3 crates of mummy parts. It's treated with the same bureaucratic detachment as any other commodity. There is no special category for pulverized human. It's just cargo. From these river towns, the crates are loaded onto boats for the journey north along the Nile to the great port cities of Alexandria or Rosetta. Alexandria for centuries was the main hub, the great clearinghouse for the mummy trade. In the bustling, chaotic port, your crates would be unloaded and stored in warehouses alongside spices from India, textiles from Persia, and grains from the Nile Delta. Here they wait for the European ships. The main players on the shipping side were the powerful maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. Their ships dominated the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. A Venetian captain, having just offloaded a cargo of European wool or timber, would be looking for valuable goods to carry on the return journey. HED by pepper, cinnamon, and yes, a few crates of mamia. A fascinating and weirdly specific detail about this trade is that, for a time, the most valuable mummies were believed to come from a specific mythical place. Ancient texts mentioned a pit in the desert where the bodies of those who had died from snake bites were thrown, and the combination of the venom and the hops, and was thought to produce a uniquely potent form of mumia. This led to a sort of brand name demand, with unscrupulous merchants in Alexandria sometimes falsely labeling their generic mummy parts as originating from this legendary snakebite pit to fetch a higher price. It's a very early example of fraudulent marketing in the pharmaceutical industry. Historians are still piecing together the sheer scale of this trade. While exact numbers are impossible to come by, the anecdotal evidence and customs records suggest it was immense. One 16th century traveler reported seeing dozens of mummies being prepared for export in a single Cairo warehouse. For the merchants involved, it was just good business. The moral or ethical implications of shipping human remains across the sea for consumption seem to have been a very minor concern, if they were a concern at all. So the dismembered scribe from Thebes or the nobleman from Satava, now reduced to anonymous fragments in a wooden crate, is hoisted aboard a Venetian galley. It's stored in the dark, swaying hold of the ship, surrounded by the smells of tar, salt water, and exotic spices. The ship will spend weeks at sea, navigating the treacherous Mediterranean, weathering storms and dodging pirates. The journey to the afterlife that the ancient Imbamos had prepared for has been replaced by a much more literal and much more gruesome journey across the water. The final destination, the apothecaries of Europe, and eventually, a desperate patient like you. After weeks at sea, rocking in the dark hold of the galley, the crate containing your future medicine finally arrives in Europe. The first breath of air it takes is likely to be the humid, salty air of Venice. For centuries, La Serenisima, the most serene Republic of Venice, was the gateway to the east. Its powerful navy controlled the sea lanes, and its merchants grew fantastically wealthy, acting as the middlemen between Europe and the Levant. Or strange medical ingredients from afar, you went through Venice. The ship navigates the final few miles, entering the spectacular Venetian lagoon. The crate is hoisted from the hold by a crane and lowered onto the bustling docks of the revered Egli Schiavoni or a similar waterfront area. The scene is one of organized chaos. Merchants in fine robes shout orders, stevedores sweat under heavy loads, and money cane bugs jingle their coins. The air is a mix of salt water, fish, and the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon and other spices wafting from the nearby warehouses of the Rialto. Your crate of human remains is just one small part of this massive river of commerce. From the docks, the crate is transported, probably on a smaller canal boat, to one of the great warehouses off on the sea. Here it will be opened and its contents inspected by a wholesale merchant. This is another crucial quality control step. The Venetian merchant is a discerning customer. He has been in the business for a long time. He knows what good mumia looks like. He might complain to the ship's captain that the product is too dry, that there's too much bone and not enough of the prized. Blackened fleshed, haggling ensues. A price is eventually agreed upon. Once purchased, the mumia is now officially part of the European supply chain. It's here, in the great trading hubs like Venice, and later Amsterdam and London, that the raw material from Egypt is processed and distributed across the continent. The big-time Venetian merchant won't sell directly to a small-town apothecary like the one you visited. He sells in bulk to other, smaller distributors. A merchant from Germany might buy a barrel. A trader from France might purchase a whole crate. This distribution network was remarkably sophisticated. Using Europe's network of rivers and primitive roads, the mumia would travel onward. A portion of that crate from Venice might be loaded onto a river barge and begin the long, slow journey up the Po River, over the Alps via treacherous mountain passes, and down the Rhine, destined for the apothecaries of the Holy Roman Empire. Another portion might be loaded onto a coastal vessel for a trip around the boot of Italy, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and up the Atlantic coast to the markets of Paris, London, or Antwerp. One of the more peculiar historical footnotes of this trade is the role of public health officials. In some cities, there were regulations governing the quality of medicines. A city official might be tasked with inspecting a new shipment of mumia to ensure it was of good quality and not fraudulent. This creates the truly surreal image of a respected civic officer solemnly examining a pile of dismembered Egyptian bodies and giving it his official stamp of approval. The idea of counterfeit mumia was a genuine concern, though as we'll see, the definition of counterfeit was about to get very blurry. This is a point where historians who study economic networks get really interested. The mumia trade wasn't always free for all. It followed established trade routes, relied on complex financial instruments like letters of credit, and was subject to the same market forces as any other product. The price would fluctuate based on supply from Egypt, the dangers of piracy in the Mediterranean, and demand from the Great Plague outbreaks that periodically swept Europe. The price of mumia would skyrocket as desperate cities bought up any supply they could get their hands on. So, the piece of the band scribe that you eventually consumed might have had an epic journey. Dug from the sand in Egypt, hacked apart in a tomb, sold to a local middleman. Packed in a warehouse in Alexandria, shipped across the sea to Venice, sold to a German distributor at the Rialto market, carried over the Alps on a mule, and finally sold to your local apothecary at a regional trade fair. It's an object that has passed through dozens of hands and crossed multiple borders. When you bought that little paper packet, you weren't just buying a cure, you were buying the end product of a vast, invisible, and incredibly strange globalized industry. Back in your sickbed, you're blissfully unaware of the complex international trade network that delivered your medicine. You just know that it was expensive and you hope effective, but the very success of this network was creating a major problem, a supply chain crisis. The simple, brutal fact was that there are only so many ancient Egyptians buried in the ground, and Europe's appetite for them was ravenous. For the first few centuries of the trade, the supply of genuine tomb-braided mummies, while not infinite, was plentiful enough. The necropolises of Egypt were vast, and the number of harvesters was relatively small. But as the demand exploded in the 15th and 16th centuries, the pressure on the supply chain mounted. The easy-to-reach tombs were looted first. The mummy hunters had to go deeper into the desert, excavate more challenging sites, and take greater risks. The cost of extraction went up. At the same time, the Ottoman authorities in Egypt, who had long been tolerant of the trade, began to have second thoughts. It's a matter of historical debate why this shift occurred. Was it a newfound respect for the ancient heritage of the land they governed? Unlikely. Was it a moral awakening about the grim nature of the business? Possible, but probably not the main driver. The most likely reason was control and money. They saw a hugely profitable, semi-illicit trade happening under their noses and decided they wanted a bigger piece of it, or wanted to shut it down to consolidate power. Whatever the reason, crackdowns began. Exporting mummies became more difficult, more dangerous, and more expensive. The merchants in Venice and Alexandria started to feel the pinch. Their supply was becoming unreliable. Shipments were smaller and less frequent. But the demand from apothecaries across Europe wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was growing. Physicians were still prescribing it. Patients were still demanding it. And apothecaries were terrified of running out of one of their most popular and profitable products. This created a classic economic scenario: soaring demand meets dwindling supply. The price of genuine Egyptian mumia went through the roof. It became a luxury good, affordable only to the very wealthy. The king could still get his dose. But what about you? What about the average person with a bad cough and a few coins to their name? Your local apothecary was now in a bind. He couldn't get the real stuff, or at least not at a price his customers could afford. But he still had people lining up at his door, desperate for a cure. What was he to do? This is where human ingenuity, fueled by greed, gets truly creative. If you can't get the real product, you make your own. The era of the genuine Egyptian mummy was drawing to a close, and the era of the counterfeit was about to begin. This wasn't just a matter of passing off low-quality goods as high-quality ones. This was a fundamental shift in the very definition of the product. The market needed mummies, and if ancient Egypt couldn't provide them. A strange and little-known detail from this period is the mummy concession. Before the official crackdowns, some enterprising individuals had tried to corner the market. One French adventurer, for example, supposedly secured a license from the Egyptian ruler, giving him the exclusive right to collect and export all the mummies from a certain region. These attempts to monopolize the supply were a clear sign that the resource was becoming scarce and valuable. When these legalish avenues closed, The black market and the counterfeit market were the only options left. So the stage was set for one of the most ghoulish cottage industries in history. The logic was morbidly simple. What, fundamentally, is a mummy? It's a preserved human body. The original selling point was that it was an ancient preserved human body from Egypt. But perhaps that wasn't the most important part. Perhaps the key was just the preserved human body bit. If a fresh body could be artificially mummified, maybe it would have the same or similar medicinal properties. It was a hell of a gamble. But for the apothecaries and shady entrepreneurs of Europe, it was a gamble worth taking. The age of the pharaohs was over. The age of the fake had begun. The scarcity of authentic Egyptian mummies didn't end the trade, it just changed the business model. The demand for that dark, promising powder remained as strong as ever. So, if you can't import your ingredients, you source them locally. This led to the birth of a truly gruesome and clandestine industry, the manufacturing of fake mummies. Not in the sands of Egypt, but in the back alleys and basements of Europe. Let's be clear about what fake or counterfeit meant in this context. It wasn't about passing off sawdust as mumia. It was about passing off a freshly prepared corpse as an ancient one. The goal was to create a substitute that looked, smelled, and felt like the genuine article. The producers of this new wave of mumia were, in a way, reverse engineering the mummification process, but with a much shorter timeline and much less noble intentions. So, where did you get the raw materials for this new industry? The answer is grimly practical. You used the unwanted dead of your own society. The primary source was the bodies of executed criminals. In the 16th and 17th centuries, public executions were common, and the bodies of the condemned were often considered the property of the state, to be disposed of as the authorities saw fit. This provided a steady, reliable supply of fresh corpses. Other sources included the unclaimed bodies of the poor, who died in city hospitals or on the streets, and sometimes it was whispered victims of plagues or even freshly robbed graves. The logic behind using criminals was particularly twisted. Some proponents argued that these bodies were actually better than ancient Egyptian ones. They were fresher for one, and they often came from young, healthy individuals who died in their prime. Following the strange medical logic of the day, a body full of youthful vigor, even that of a criminal, was considered potent. You weren't just getting a preserved body, you were getting the preserved body, you were getting the preserved body of a strong, if morally dubious, individual. This led to a new kind of artisan popping up in the medical underworld, the mummy forger. One of the most detailed accounts of this process comes from the 16th century French surgeon Cleopatra, one of the first major medical figures to speak out against the practice. He described visiting a mummy-making operation in France and being utterly horrified. He saw bodies of the recently deceased being prepared for the mummy market. Imagine the scene. In a hidden cellar or a remote barn, the forgers get to work. They take a fresh corpse, often disemboweled much like the ancient Egyptian practice, but for more practical reasons of preventing rapid decay, and then treat it. They don't have access to the natural salt of the Nile Delta. Instead, they use what's available. The bodies would be coated in bitumen, the dark resinous appearance of real mumia. They might be rubbed with salt and spices to aid in preservation and to give them the correct aromatic profile. Then they had to be thoroughly dried. This is where the process gets even more macabre. The bodies were often baked in ovens or laid out to dry under the hot sun, a process that was horrificously referred to as ripening. This desiccation process was crucial. It gave the flesh the brittle, hard texture of a genuine ancient mummy. The whole operation was a race against time, trying to preserve the body before natural putrefaction set in. A historical claim that circulates, though it's hard to verify with certainty, is that some forgers would even stuff the bodies with a mix of herbs and fillers to add weight and bulk, essentially creating a human sausage before baking it. The result of this ghastly process was a mummy that, once broken up and ground into powder, was visually almost indistinguishable from the real thing. It was dark, it was brittle, and it had a vaguely spicy, tar-like smell. It was the perfect counterfeit. An unsuspecting apothecary, or even a knowingly complicit one, could purchase this powder and sell it to his customers as genuine mumia from the East. The profit margins were enormous. The raw material was free or very cheap, and the final product could be sold at the premium price of the scarce Egyptian original. Historians are still debating how widespread this practice was. Was it a niche black market, or did a significant percentage of the mummy consumed in later periods come from these European forgeries? The evidence suggests it was more common than we might like to think. So the powder you took for your coffee's origin story just got a lot more complicated. It might be a 3,000-year-old Egyptian priest, or it might be a 3-month-old French high wine, baked in an oven near Lyon. The hope in your heart now carries a chilling uncertainty. The process of creating these counterfeit mummies wasn't just a haphazard affair. Over time, the forgers developed what could almost be called a craft. While we don't have a neat, step-by-step instruction manual titled Mummy Forgery for Dummies, we can piece together the gruesome recipe from the writings of those who witnessed or investigated it, like the surgeon Amber pair. If you were an unscrupulous entrepreneur looking to get into this business, here's a rough guide you might have followed. Step 1: sourcing your raw material. This is the most crucial and most dangerous part of the operation. Your best bet is to get friendly with the local executioner. He has a steady supply of fresh, relatively healthy bodies. You'd need to pay him off, of course, to lose a body before it's thrown into a pauper's grave. Timing is everything. You need the body as fresh as possible. A secondary, more ghoulish option is to become a resurrection. That is, a grave robber. You could be caught and end up becoming raw material for a competitor. You'd focus on the fresh graves of the poor, as they were less likely to be guarded or placed in secure vaults. Step to the preparation. Once you have the body back in your secret workshop, a secluded cellar is ideal to contain the smell. The real work begins. First, you need to eviscerate it. The internal organs are the first to decay due to their high moisture and bacteria content. An incision is made in the abdomen, and the organs are removed. Some forgers might have just thrown them out, but a particularly cunning one might have dried and ground them separately to be mixed back in later to add bulk. The skull might also be opened and the brain removed, mimicking what they believed the ancient Egyptians did. Step 3: the pickling or curing. Now you need to halt decomposition. You don't have the natural Egyptian sun and dry air, nor the special natron salt. You improvise. You would rub the entire body, inside and out, with a coarse salt. This draws out the moisture, which is the enemy of preservation. You might also use other substances you've heard are good for preservation, like alum. The body would then be submerged in a vat of bitumen or pitch. This is what gives the final product its desirable black, shiny appearance, making it look like the prized, resin-rich Egyptian mummies. This soaking process could last for days or weeks. Step for the aromatic treatment. Real mummy was famous for its spicy, resinous smell, a byproduct of the frankincense, myrrh, and cedarwood oil used in Egyptian embalming. You need to replicate this. After the body is removed from its pickling bath, it would be liberally rubbed with a mixture of cheap, strong-smelling spices and herbs, cloves, cinnamon, dried lavender, maybe some myrrh if you could afford it. This serves two purposes. It masks the inevitable unpleasant odors of the process, and it gives the final powder the correct medicinal smell that apothecaries and patients would expect. Step 5: the desiccation, the grim finale. This is the make or break stage. The salted, spiced, tar-coated corpse is still full of residual moisture. It needs to be thoroughly dried to become the hard, brittle substance required. This is where the oven comes in. A low, slow bake for several days. The goal isn't to cook the flesh, but to dehydrate it completely, turning it into a kind of human jerky. One particularly horrifying, and likely true, detail is that the forgers had to be careful with the temperature. Too hot, and the fat in the body would render out, creating a greasy, unusable mess and a truly horrific smell. It was a ghastly form of low-temperature cooking. If an oven wasn't available, the body might be hung in a chimney to be smoked and dried, or left in a dry, airy attic for months. Step 6: final touches and distribution. Once the body is as hard and dry as old wood, it's ready. It's then broken apart with hammers, a process that would be much easier than with a genuine, mineralized mummy. The pieces are ground down into a coarse powder using a large mortar and pestle. You might mix in some other materials, charcoal dust, ground up animal bones, or even dirt to increase your volume and profit. The final powder is then packed into sacks or barrels and sold to a distributor or directly to less scrupulous apothecaries who would then label it genuine Egyptian mumia. Historians still debate the nuances of this process. Was it always this elaborate? Probably not. There was likely a spectrum from high-end forgeries that followed all these steps to cheap, crude versions that were little more than sundry limbs ground to a powder. But the existence of this gruesome craft shows the incredible lengths people would go to in order to meet market demand, and the terrifying void of scientific understanding that allowed it to flourish. So, there you are, back in your small, smoky house. You've had your dose of the famous wonder drug. The ale has warmed you, and the sheer psychological relief of having done something is a comfort in itself. But now, a disturbing question hangs in the air. A question that was likely whispered among the more cynical consumers of the era. How do you know what you just swallowed, or, more accurately, who you just swallowed? Are you benefiting from the millennia-old vital essence of a noble scribe from the court of Ramesses II, a man who oversaw the construction of temples and whose body was prepared with the sacred rites of the Egyptian faith, or have you just ingested the ground-up remains of One-Eyed Jack, a notorious highwayman who was hanged at the crossroads last autumn and subsequently baked in a cellar in a nearby city? For the average person, telling the difference was completely impossible. The final product, a coarse, dark brown powder, looked, smelled, and, one assumes, tasted more or less the same regardless of its origin. Both the genuine article and the counterfeit were made of desiccated human tissue, often treated with spices and pitch. Once it was pulverized in the apothecary's mortar and pestle, the evidence of its true identity was destroyed. You were putting your faith entirely in the honesty of your supply chain, a chain that, as we've seen, was riddled with deception and ghoulish opportunism. Even for the experts of the day, telling true mumia from a forgery was a serious challenge. Apothecaries and physicians developed their own rules of thumb for authentication. Some believed that genuine mumia should stick to the teeth, while the fake kind would not. Others claimed that true mumia had a uniquely fragrant, balsamic odor that was impossible to replicate with cheap spices. One of the most common tests was to check its solubility. Genuine mumia, rich in resins, was supposed to dissolve smoothly in warm spirits, creating a dark, uniform tincture. The fake stuff, it was claimed, would just create a clumpy, muddy mess. The problem, of course, is that these tests were wildly unreliable. The composition of real Egyptian mummies varied enormously depending on the dynasty, the social status of the deceased, and the specific embalming materials used. A real mummy from a later, poorer period might be dry and crumbly, while a high-end forgery, skillfully prepared with bitumen and resins, might pass the authenticity test with flying colors. It was a connoisseursship of the macabre, based on folklore and guesswork rather than science. This uncertainty led to a kind of brand anxiety among consumers who could afford to be picky. The wealthy would go to great lengths to secure what they believed was the genuine article. They would pay exorbitant prices for mumia that came with a good story, a convincing tale of its origin from a famous to more reliable Venetian merchant. The provenance of your powder became a status symbol. My mumia, a lord might boast, comes directly from the King's Valley. Whether it actually did was another matter entirely. Here's a little-known fact that adds another layer of confusion: not all fake mummies were European. As the demand for exports grew, some enterprising locals in Egypt got in on the forgery game themselves. Why go to all the trouble of robbing a 3,000-year-old tomb when you could just take a recently deceased peasant, dry them out in the hots and for a few months, and sell them to a gullible European raider? As a genuine antique, these sand-dried mummies became another product on the market, blurring the lines even further. They were Egyptian, yes, but they weren't ancient. Historians are still trying to untangle this web of fakes, forgeries, and genuine articles. It's a detective story where most of the evidence is being consumed, so the question of real versus fake was a constant source of anxiety and debate. It created a marketplace of lemons, where the buyer had no real way of assessing the quality of the product, and in a strange way, it might not have even mattered. The placebo effect is a powerful thing. If you believed that the powder you were taking was the potent remains of an ancient pharaoh, it might well have made you feel better, regardless of its true origin. The healing power was not in the substance itself, but in the story you told yourself about it. Whether that story was true history or a grim fairy tale about a baked criminal was, for all practical purposes, irrelevant to the final outcome. The mystery in your cup was as much a part of the cure as the powder itself, while you and millions of others were stirring pulverized people into your wine. Not everyone was on board with this grand, ghoulish tradition. Even at the height of the Mummy craze, there were voices of skepticism and disgust. These were the killjoys at the cannibalistic party. The people brave enough to stand up and ask the deeply uncomfortable question, are we sure this is a good idea? We are, eating people, right? One of the earliest and most important of these dissenting voices belonged to the man we mentioned earlier, Ambroise Père. Père was no stuffy academic, he was a battlefield surgeon in 16th century France, a practical man who revolutionized surgical techniques. He saw the horrors of war up close, and he had little patience for medical traditions that didn't produce real results. He was one of the first prominent medical figures to reject Mummy, and he did so with undisguised contempt. Pére's objections were twofold. First, he was deeply skeptical of its supposed benefits. He saw patients taking it for all sorts of ailments and saw no evidence that it actually worked. He famously wrote that not only did this wicked drug do no good, it often caused great pains in their stomachs, with vexation and stinking vomit. He was, in essence, one of the first to document its negative side effects, dismissing it as not just useless, but actively harmful. His second objection was moral and practical. As we know, he had personally witnessed the gruesome process of forging mummies from the bodies of the executed. He was appalled by the deception and the barbarity of it. He wrote with cutting sarcasm about the miserable and naughty commodity and mocked the idea that the ancient Egyptians, whom he respected, would have taken such care to preserve their dead only for them to be eaten by us sick people. He called out the apothecaries for their greed and the physicians for their gullibility. His argument was simple at best. You're eating a useless ancient Egyptian at worst. You're eating a freshly baked, disease-ridden criminal. Neither, he argued, was a sound medical choice. Père was a big deal, but he was fighting against centuries of ingrained tradition. His voice was influential, but it was just one among many. For every Père, there were 100 physicians who continued to prescribe Mummy without a second thought. Another source of opposition, perhaps surprisingly, came from within the trade itself. Some merchants in Egypt, dealing in what they considered the authentic product, grew angry about the European forgeries. Their objections weren't moral, they were commercial. The fakes were undercutting their market. One such merchant, a man named Guy de la Fontaine, traveled to Alexandria in the mid-16th century to inspect the Mummy trade. He discovered a major Jewish merchant who was cornering the market in counterfeit mummies made from the bodies of the poor. When confronted, the merchant apparently wasn't the least bit ashamed. He admitted freely that he just couldn't be bothered to go find ancient tombs when there were so many fresh bodies readily available. This account, when it got back to Europe, further fueled the debate about what people were actually consuming. Here's a little-known fact: the debate even had a religious dimension. Some Christian theologians began to question the practice on spiritual grounds. The core of their argument revolved around the resurrection. Christian doctrine holds that at the end of time, the dead will be resurrected in their bodies. So if you've consumed someone else's body, and it has become part of your own, what happens on Judgment Day? Whose body part as it does the person who was eaten get to be whole again? It was a theological puzzle box with no easy answer. While this argument likely didn't trouble the average person with a fever, it added another layer of intellectual doubt to the practice among the educated clergy. Historians are still debating the impact of these dissenting voices. Did they significantly slow down the trade for a long time? The answer is probably no. The belief in Mummy was too strong, and the lack of viable medical alternatives was too stark. Pére's arguments were logical, but they couldn't compete with the deep-seated hope and tradition that Mummy represented. It's like trying to convince someone that their lucky charm doesn't work. The evidence is secondary to the belief. So even as these debates raged in medical faculties and theological circles, you lying in your bed would have been completely unaware of them. Your apothecary certainly wouldn't have mentioned the controversy. He sold you a cure, not a debate. But slowly, imperceptibly, the seeds of doubt were being sown. The first cracks were appearing in the foundation of this ancient and bizarre medical edifice. The age of reason was still a long way off, but the first few brave, clear-eyed individuals were beginning to light the candles that would eventually illuminate the absurdity of it all. While you're at home taking your medicinal dose, hoping it will save your life, the very wealthy were finding a different, and much more entertaining, use for mummies. For the European aristocracy of the 17th and 18th centuries, a genuine, intact Egyptian mummy wasn't just medicine, it was a status symbol, a historical curiosity, and the centerpiece of a very strange form of evening entertainment, the mummy unwrapping party. Imagine this. You're a guest at a lavish party in a London townhouse or a Parisian salon. The air is filled with the scent of beeswax candles and expensive perfume. After a fine dinner and perhaps a string quartet performance, the host, a wealthy lord or a well-traveled collector, announces the main event. Servants carry in a long, mysterious object wrapped in canvas. It's placed on a table in the center of the drawing room. A hush falls over the assembled guests as the host, with a theatrical flourish, reveals an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus. This was the ultimate display of wealth and worldliness. Owning an actual mummy was like owning a priceless work of art, a piece of a lost world. It proved that you were not just rich, but also educated, adventurous, and connected enough to acquire such a rare artifact. The parties were exclusive events, and an invitation was highly coveted. The host, often with the help of a surgeon or an antiquarian, would then begin the unwrapping process. This wasn't a quick or delicate affair. The ancient linen bandages, hardened by resins and time, were brittle and often stuck fast to the body. They would be cut, pried, and pulled away, layer by layer. The guests would lean in, their silks and satins rustling, their faces a mixture of fascination and morbid curiosity. With each layer removed, the sense of anticipation grew. What would they find inside a perfectly preserved face? Royal jewels, ancient papyrus scrolls, covered in mysterious hieroglyphs. The reality was often less glamorous. The body was usually a blackened, brittle, and not particularly pleasant-smelling thing. Jewels were almost never found, as most tombs had been thoroughly looted in antiquity. But the thrill was in the possibility. As the final layers of bandages were removed, small amulets and trinkets might be discovered. A fine scare beetle, a small stone ankh, or a beaded necklace. These were the party favors. The host would pass them around for the guests to admire, and sometimes a particularly favored guest might be allowed to keep one as a souvenir. It was the ultimate conversation piece, a 3,000-year-old memento from your night out. This practice seems incredibly disrespectful to us today, a gross violation of a sacred object. But in the mindset of the time, it was framed as an act of scientific inquiry, a private lecture in history and anatomy. Of course, it was also a sensationalist spectacle. The line between education and entertainment was very blurry. Historians are still debating the primary motivation for these events. Was it a genuine, if clumsy, thirst for knowledge, or was it simply a morbid fad? The 18th century equivalent of a viral unboxing video. The truth is, it was a complex cocktail of both. One bizarre, and likely apocryphal, story that circulated was that of a mummy that, when unwrapped, was found to have a single, perfectly preserved green pea clenched in its teeth. This tale, though almost certainly untrue, captures the kind of romantic and fanciful expectations guests had at these events. They wanted a story. This trend had a significant impact on the mummy trade. It created a new market for whole, intact mummies which were far more valuable than the broken-up bits sold for medicine. This put even more pressure on the tomb raiders in Egypt, who now had an incentive to extract their finds as carefully as possible. A well-preserved mummy in its original coffin could fetch a fortune from a European collector. So, while you were consuming the mummy as a life-saving drug, the very richest members of society were literally unwrapping it for fun. It's a stark illustration of the class divide. For the poor and the sick, the mummy was a desperate hope. For the rich and the bored, it was a thrilling diversion, a piece of the exotic, consumable in a different way, not as medicine, but as entertainment. The same object, a preserved human body, held to completely different meanings depending on who was looking at it. The bizarre journey of the Egyptian dead doesn't end in medicine cabinets or at high society parties. There was another, quieter, and more artistic afterlife for them on the canvases of Europe's great painters. For several centuries, the same ground-up mummy powder that you took for your cough was a prized and essential ingredient in the artist's studio, used to create a unique and highly sought-after pigment known as mummy brown. Let's imagine you're not the patient, but an aspiring painter in the 18th or 19th century. You are in your studio, the air thick with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. You're working on a grand historical painting or a moody landscape. You need a specific color, a rich, transparent brown with a beautiful warmth and a unique ability to create deep luminous shadows. You wouldn't reach for burnt umber or raw sienna. You'd reach for a little pouch of that special pigment, mummy brown. The pigment was made from exactly what the name suggests. It was a mixture of ground-up Egyptian mummy, both human and, oddly enough, feline mummies, which were also plentiful, and a binder like pitch or myrrh. This gruesome concoction was then ground into a fine powder with oil to create the final paint. The resulting color was prized for its transparency, which allowed painters to apply it in thin layers or glazes, to create effects of depth and shadow that were difficult to achieve with other brown pigment. It became a favorite of many artists, particularly the pre-Raphaelites in the 19th century, who loved its rich, evocative tone. So when you look at certain paintings from this era, particularly those with deep, shadowy backgrounds or warm, fleshy skin tones, you may very well be looking at the last mortal remains of an ancient Egyptian. The art world's use of mummies is a perfect example of how an object's value is culturally constructed. For the apothecary, the mummy's value was in its supposed vital essence. For the artist, its value was purely aesthetic, in its unique physical properties as a pigment. The same raw material was being processed for entirely different ends. The story of Mummy Brown is filled with strange anecdotes. One of the most famous involves the pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones. The story goes that one day his friend, the writer Rudyard Kipling, whose father was an art school principal and curator, was visiting his studio. Kipling, knowing the origin of the pigment, casually asked Burne-Jones if he was aware of what his favorite brown paint was actually made of. When Burne-Jones was informed that it was, in fact, made of dead pharaohs, he was supposedly so horrified that he dramatically retrieved his tub of Mummy Brown from his paint box and insisted on giving it a proper burial in his garden. This story, which historians are still debating the complete accuracy of, perfectly illustrates the slow shift in attitude towards the use of human remains. What was once seen as perfectly normal was beginning to be viewed as ghoulish and unacceptable. Another little-known fact is that the quality of Mummy Brown paint was notoriously unreliable. This makes perfect sense when you consider the source material. The final color and texture of the paint depended entirely on the specific mummy used. Was it a well-preserved, resin-rich mummy that would produce a fine, transparent pigment? Was it a poorly preserved one, with more bone and less desiccated flesh, that might result in a grittier, less useful paint? Paint manufacturers would even advertise the quality of their mummies. A catalogue from one 19th century supplier proudly offered tubes of Mummy Brown, assuring customers that they were made from the finest quality mummies. The use of Mummy Brown continued surprisingly late. It was a standard color in many artists, but as well into the early 20th century. It only truly fell out of favor when the supply of raw material, actual mummies, finally dwindled to almost nothing. In 1964, the London-based paint maker Robertson & Co. announced that they had officially run out of mummies and would no longer a single, large mummy for years, and it was finally gone. The paint color Mummy Brown still exists, but it's just a name. It's a synthetic mixture of other pigments, designed to replicate the hue of the original, without any of the actual human ingredients. So, the legacy of this strange trade lives on, hidden in plain sight in the shadowy corners of paintings hanging in the world's most famous museums. It's a quiet, artistic epilogue to a story of medicine, greed, and misunderstanding. The ancient Egyptian who hoped for eternal life achieved a strange and unexpected form of it, not in the afterlife, but as a subtle, beautiful shadow on a canvas. Your faith in Mumia wasn't just a quirk of the common folk. It went all the way to the top, while you were taking your humble dose in a smoky cottage. Kings, queens, and popes were doing the same in their gilded palaces and sacred halls. The use of powdered mummy wasn't just a medical trend, it was a royal and ecclesiastical seal of approval that gave the practice an unshakable legitimacy for centuries. We've already mentioned King Francis I of France and his personal, travel-sized pouch of mumia. He wasn't an anomaly. He was the norm. His contemporary, King Henry II of England, another larger-than-life monarch, was also a proponent of these kinds of remedies. In a court obsessed with health, vitality, and most importantly for Henry the production of a male heir, no potential cure was off the table. While specific prescriptions for Henry are scarce, the royal apothecaries of his time certainly stocked and dispensed mumia. Perhaps the most famous royal user was King Charles II of England, the merry monarch of the Restoration. Charles was a passionate amateur chemist and had his own private laboratory where he experimented with concocting various medicines. One of his most prized creations was a tincture known as the King's Drops. The exact recipe was a closely guarded secret, but its primary, and most shocking, ingredient was powdered human skull. While not strictly Egyptian mummy, it came from the exact same school of thought that consuming parts of the dead could impart vitality. The skulls were often sourced from Ireland, giving the remedy the ghoulish nickname Irish mummy. Charles I took his drops religiously as a general health tonic and believed in them so fervently that on his deathbed, suffering from a seizure, his physicians forced a final, massive dose down his throat. It did not, as you might guess, save him. The belief was so ingrained that it shaped royal medical care. When a king fell ill, the stakes were astronomical. The health of the monarch was the health of the kingdom. Royal physicians, under immense pressure to produce results, would throw every known remedy at their royal patient. And in their medical arsenal, mumia was a top-shelf treatment. It was expensive, it was exotic, and it was exotic, and it was backed by the authority of ancient medical text. To not prescribe it for a seriously ill king might have been seen as negligent. This royal endorsement had a powerful trickle-down effect. If the king's own doctors were prescribing it, it must be the best medicine in the land. This is a point historians often emphasize, the role of elite emulation. Common people have always been aspirational, wanting to imitate the habits and fashions of the rich and powerful. If the aristocracy was taking mumia to stay healthy, then a merchant or a farmer would want to do the same, even if it meant spending a week's wages on a tiny packet of the stuff. The royal seal of approval was the best marketing campaign mumia could have ever asked for. Even the church, the other great power in Europe, was not immune. While some theologians debated the finer points of resurrection, many popes and cardinals were consumers of mumia. The papal court in Rome was a hub of medical learning, and the pope's personal physician would have been trained in the same texts as any other high-ranking doctor. There are records of the Vatican stocking and dispensing mumia. This created a strange paradox. An institution dedicated to the sacredness of the body and the soul was endorsing a medicine made from the desecrated remains of the dead. One lesser known, and rather ironic, detail is that the demand for mumia contributed to the destruction of early Christian history in Egypt. Many of the mummies harvested during the later periods were not ancient, pagan Egyptians, but the preserved bodies of Coptic Christians, who had continued the practice of mummification for centuries after converting. So, it's entirely possible that a devout Catholic king in Europe, seeking a cure, was consuming the body of an early Christian martyr from Egypt. Historians of the Coptic Church have long lamented this tragic and unrecognized chapter of the mummy trade. The unwavering belief of the ruling class is perhaps the single most important reason why the practice lasted for so long. It wasn't a folk remedy that persisted in remote villages. It was a pillar of establishment medicine, endorsed and consumed by the most powerful people in the world. Their faith gave it an aura of invincibility that was very hard to challenge. When your king and your pope both taking the same medicine, who are you to question its effectiveness? As you lie there, somewhere in the 17th or 18th century, the world outside your window is beginning to change in ways you can't possibly imagine. The unquestioning faith that defined your era is slowly, painstakingly, giving way to a new and powerful false reason. This period, which we now call the Age of Enlightenment, would spell the beginning of the end for Mummy and countless other traditions based on superstition rather than evidence. The first few candles of doubt, lit by men like Cleopatra, were about to become a bonfire. The Enlightenment was a philosophical earthquake. Thinkers like René Descartes, with his famous "I think, therefore I am," championed the power of human reason to understand the universe. In England, Francis Bacon was developing the scientific method, arguing that knowledge should be built not on ancient authority, but on observation, experimentation, and evidence. This was a revolutionary idea, and it began to seep into every field of human endeavor, including medicine. A new generation of physicians and scientists began to look at the human body not as a mystical container for humors, but as a complex machine. They started to perform more systematic anatomical dissections, mapping the body structures with unprecedented accuracy. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, proving that the heart was a pump, not a spiritual center. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, with his homemade microscopes, discovered a hidden world of animalcules, what we now know as bacteria and other microorganisms, though their connection to disease wouldn't be understood for another century. In this new intellectual climate, a remedy like Mummy started to look less like powerful medicine and more like ridiculous folklore. The new rationalist doctors began to pick apart the logic behind it. The idea of a vital force being transferred from a dead body to a living one no longer made sense. It couldn't be measured, observed, or proven. The practice of using it was based on the authority of ancient texts. Avicenna, Ahazes, Galen, and the Enlightenment was all about questioning authority. The arguments against it became more scientific and less purely moral. Doctors started to ask, what is this substance? Chemically, they began to analyze it. They found it was composed of bitumen sometimes, desiccated proteins, salts, and whatever spices had been used. There was nothing there that would suggest a curative property. The old poetic "it preserves the dead, so it must preserve the living" was replaced by a blunter, more chemical analysis. It's just old, dead tissue and tar. Why would that cure your cough? One of the great, and often overlooked, champions of this new skepticism was a London physician named Dr. Robert James. In the mid-18th century, he published a massive, multi-volume medicinal dictionary. In his entry for Mummy, he absolutely demolished it. He didn't just question its efficacy, he ridiculed it. He called the practice superstitious and useless and pointed out the absurdity of the whole supply chain, from the Canaanish Egyptian raiders to the Kafkiris. He laid out all the arguments, the uncertainty of the source, the fraud, the lack of any discernible effect. His dictionary was widely read and hugely influential, helping to turn the tide of medical opinion. A little-known fact that highlights this shift is the changing nature of medical publishing. In the 16th century, a medical text would simply list Mummy and its uses. By the mid-18th century, a medical text was more likely to have a long, skeptical entry about it, often concluding that it should be avoided. The burden of proof had shifted. Instead of assuming it worked, the medical community was now demanding evidence, and there was none to be found. Historians often debate the exact tipping point. There was no single day when everyone decided Mummy was nonsense. It was a slow, gradual process of falling out of fashion. As new, slightly more effective chemical remedies were being developed, things like quinine for malaria or digitalis for heart conditions, the old, traditional remedies began to seem obsolete. Mummy was starting to look like a relic from a more primitive, superstitious age. So while you might still be taking Mummy in 1750, your doctor, if he's young and has been reading the latest books from London or Paris, is probably prescribing it with a roll of his eyes. He gives it to you because you expect it, because it's what his master taught him to do. But in his own mind, he's starting to think it's worthless. The belief is draining away, not from the bottom up, but from the top down. The intellectual foundations of the practice have been shattered, and it's only a matter of time before the whole bizarre edifice comes tumbling down. The intellectual doubts of the Enlightenment weren't confined to scholars' dusty studies. They began to have real-world consequences. As the 18th century rolled into the 19th, the official, institutional world of medicine began to formally turn its back on the pharaohs. The slow, quiet rejection of Mummy was about to become a loud, public, and official breakup, The main battlefield for this final struggle was the pharmacopoeia. These weren't just dusty reference books, they were official, oft unlegally binding, documents that defined what constituted a legitimate medicine. For centuries, Mummies had held a place of honor in these texts. The London Pharmacopoeia, one of the most influential in the world, had listed Mummies as a standard drug since its first publication in 1618. For an apothecary to be licensed, he had to stock the drugs listed in the pharmacopoeia. Its inclusion was a guarantee of its legitimacy. The turning point came in the mid-18th century, when the editors of the London Pharmacopoeia were preparing a new edition in 1746. A fierce debate erupted. The modernized RS, influenced by Enlightenment rationalism, wanted Mummies gone. They argued it was a filthy and obsolete remedy, a relic of a superstitious age that had no place in a modern medical text. The traditionalists pushed back, arguing from a position of historical authority. It had been used for centuries, recommended by the great physicians of the past. Who were they to discard the wisdom of their ancestors? The modernizer S1. In the 1746 edition of the London Pharmacopoeia, Mummies was quietly dropped. There was no grand announcement, no press release. It just wasn't there anymore. For the medical establishment, this was a seismic event. It was an official declaration that the king of remedies had no clothes. Other major European pharmacopoeias soon followed suit. The Paris Pharmacopoeia dropped it. The German states began to remove it from their official lists, one by one. The institutional pillars that had supported the practice for 500 years were being knocked down. This had a direct impact on your local apothecary. He might still have a dusty jar of the stuff in the back of his shop, but he was no longer required to. Medical students were no longer being taught about its virtues. Instead, they were being taught to laugh at it, to see it as an example of the ignorance of previous generations. Prescribing it started to become a sign of being old-fashioned, of being out of touch with the latest medical science. One fascinating, little-known consequence of this was the reclassification of mummies. As their medical value plummeted, their scientific and historical value soared. This was the era of Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, which brought back a wealth of information and artifacts, sparking a new wave of Egyptomania across Europe. Mummies were no longer seen as a raw material for drugs, but as priceless historical artifacts. They belonged in a museum, not a medicine bottle. This shift is perfectly illustrated by the unwrapping parties we talked about. They transitioned from being quasi-medical dissections to being historical and archaeological events. Historians still discuss the reasons for this final, official rejection. Was it purely the triumph of scientific reason? Mostly, yes. But there were other factors. The rise of a new kind of medical consumerism played a part. Patients were becoming more educated and starting to demand cleaner, more palatable, and more scientific-sounding medicines. A mysterious brown powder from a grave started to seem less appealing than a clearly labeled bottle of chemical tincture. The aesthetics of medicine were changing. The final nail in the coffin was the utter lack of evidence. In the new age of clinical observation, if a drug didn't produce consistent, observable results, it was discarded, and Mummies was the king of inconsistent results. For every person who, like you, took it and felt a little better, likely due to placebo or the natural course of the illness, there were countless others who took it and got no better, who took it and got no better, or, as Geographic noted, got violently ill. Its failures became impossible to ignore. So the jar of Mummies on your apothecary's shelf is now an endangered species. It's a symbol of a dying era. The next time you get a cough, a generation from now, your doctor will likely prescribe something entirely different, perhaps a syrup containing opium to suppress the cough, a remedy that was at least consistently effective. The age of eating people for your health was officially over. The medical world had, after a very long and very strange detour, finally moved on. The official decrees from London and Paris echoed through the medical world, but old habits die hard. The final disappearance of Mummies from the pharmacy shelf was a slow fade, not a sudden snap. For a long time after it was officially discredited, it lingered on in the shadowy corners of folk medicine and in the shops of the most traditional, backwater apothecaries. The belief in its power, nurtured for half a millennium, couldn't be extinguished by a committee's decision alone. Imagine it's now the early 19th century. Your great-grandchild has a cough. The local doctor, a young man fresh from medical school in Edinburgh, scoffs at the idea of mumia. He talks about pulmonary affections and miasmatic influences. He prescribes a chemical concoction and advises bed rest. But your family, remembering the old ways, might still have a secret stash of the brown powder, but years ago unsaved for a true emergency. An elderly grandparent might furtively mix a small dose into the sick child's drink, whispering that the old cures are the best cures. This is how a medical tradition dies. It retreats from the mainstream into the realm of folklore. The trade, which had once been a mighty river of commerce, dwindled to a tiny, illicit trickle. The demand from official apothecaries vanished. There were no more bulk orders from the great hospitals or royal courts. The only remaining customers were a handful of die-hard traditionalists and, of course, the artists who still coveted the pigment mummy brown. This artistic demand, though small, was enough to keep a tiny, specialized black market alive for a few more decades. The mummy hunters of Egypt found themselves out of a job. With no one to sell to, the gruesome harvest ceased. The tombs of the pharaohs, after centuries of relentless plunder, were finally left in relative peace, at least until the arrival of the next wave of invaders, the scientific archaeologists, armed not with axes and sacks, but with trowels and notebook. In Europe, the last jars of mummies sat on pharmacy shelves gathering dust. An apothecary might keep a small amount on hand for a very specific, very old, and very wealthy client who refused to accept any other remedy. But it was no longer a profitable item. It was a curiosity. A young apprentice, cleaning the shop, might pick up the jar, read the faded label, and shudder, amazed that people ever consumed such a thing. One of the more poignant final chapters in the story of medicinal mumia comes from the world of veterinary medicine. It's a little-known fact that many cures that fall out of favor in human medicine often have a second life in the treatment of animals. Well into the 19th century, some veterinary manuals still recommended mumia, mixed with tar and other ingredients, as a salve for injured horses. The logic was that it was a powerful sealant for wounds. It's possible that one of the last beings on earth to be treated with the ground-up remains of a pharaoh was not a king or a peasant, but a lame horse in the English countryside. It's a humble and rather sad end for a substance that was once considered the most powerful medicine in the world. Historians who track commodity prices have noted the collapse of mumia's market value. What was once worth its weight in silver became virtually worthless. There are accounts of dusty barrels of it being discovered in the cellars of old European pharmacies and being unceremoniously thrown out with the trash, the last bits of pulverized human, once the object of so much hope and so much greed, were swept into the gutters, their long, strange journey finally at an end. The final pinch of dust is used. The last jar is emptied. The memory of its taste and its supposed power fades from living memory, becoming just a bizarre footnote in old medical books. The silence that falls over the trade is profound. For the first time in over 500 years, no one in Europe is actively trying to buy, sell, or consume a powdered Egyptian. The world has moved on. Your cough, which started this whole journey, is now being treated with things that, while sometimes still ineffective or dangerous, are at least not sorts from a desecrated grave. The long, strange fever dream of mumia is finally over. And so the story comes to a close. The last dusty jar has been cleared from the apothecary's shelf. We can now step back and look at this entire incredible saga from the safe distance of modern history. What are we to make of this centuries-long delusion? It's tempting to laugh at the ignorance of our ancestors, to shake our heads at their gullibility, but to do so is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth that the story of mumia reveals about all of us. At its heart, the history of mumia is a story about fear. It's about the profound, primal, and deeply human fear of sickness and death. In an age before germs were understood, when a simple infection could be a death sentence, people were desperate. They lived with a level of uncertainty about their own survival that is almost impossible for us to comprehend, and in the face of that overwhelming fear, they reached for anything that offered even a sliver of hope. The logic of mumia, so absurd to us now, was built on a framework of belief that made perfect sense at the time. It combined the authority of the ancients, the exoticist of a distant, magical land, and a beautifully simple, poetic idea that one could conquer death by consuming that which had already seemed to conquer it. It was a powerful narrative, and in the absence of a better one, it was more than enough. The story was the medicine. Looking back, we can see the entire episode as a massive, uncontrolled, and entirely unethical clinical trial that lasted for 500 years. The results subtly inconclusive. The drug had no discernible therapeutic effect beyond that of a placebo. But the placebo effect, as we now know, is a real and powerful phenomenon. The belief, the ritual, the exorcist, the sheer cost of the remedy, all these things would have contributed to a patient's psychological state, which can have a real impact on their physical health. Historians and medical anthropologists are still debating how to weigh the placebo success of such historical remedies. Did it work if the patient believed it worked, even if the mechanism was purely psychological? The story of Mummies is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked tradition and the uncritical acceptance of ancient authority. For centuries, doctors and patients alike were trapped in a loop of circular reasoning. We use it because the ancient masters said it worked, and it must work because we've been using it for centuries. It took the radical skepticism of the Enlightenment to finally break that chain. It's a powerful reminder that we've always done it this way, is one of the most dangerous phrases in any language. One of the strangest and most lasting legacies of this whole affair is its ghost-like presence in our language. The word mummy itself has been forever colored by this history. For the ancient Egyptians, the word for a preserved body was sah. The word mummy, as we know, came from a Persian word for bitumen and was mistakenly applied to the bodies. So the very name we use to refer to these sacred objects is linguistic fossil, a permanent record of this bizarre medical misunderstanding. As you lie there now, your fever finally broken, the cough subsided, you can breathe a sigh of relief. You survived. Was it the mummy? Was it the ale? Was it just your own immune system finally winning the fight? You'll never know for sure. But as you look back on this strange chapter of history, you're left with a profound sense of wonder at the human capacity for both incredible ingenuity and breathtaking absurdity. We are creatures who can build cathedrals and compose symphonies, but who also once thought it was a perfectly sensible idea to eat the 3,000-year-old dead to cure a headache. And that strange, uncomfortable, and deeply fascinating contradiction is perhaps the most human thing of all. The world you leave behind, the world where you recovered from your cough, is on the brink of an earth-shattering revolution. The change won't come from a new king or a great war, but from a place you didn't ever think to look a microscope. The real magic, the cure that will finally make remedies like Mummies seem not just wrong but laughably insane, is about to be revealed. And it's been there all along, invisible, waiting. Let's fast forward a century or so from your bedside to the mid-19th century. The central mystery of sickness, what causes it, is finally being solved. In France, a man named Louis Pasteur demonstrates that fermentation and decay are caused by living microorganisms. In Germany, Robert Koch takes this idea and runs with it, proving that specific germs cause specific diseases, like anthrax and tuberculosis. This is it. This is the moment everything changes. Germ theory is born. Suddenly, the ancient story of the four humors, of imbalances of cold and wet, is replaced by a thrilling, terrifying new narrative. Sickness isn't a mystical internal discord, it's an invasion. You are a fortress, and your body is under siege by an army of invisible microbes. This new story is a revelation. It gives humanity, for the first time, a real, tangible enemy to fight. You can't fight excess phlegm, but you can, maybe, fight a bacterium. But this new knowledge was not an easy pill for the establishment to swallow. One of the most tragic stories from this transition is that of Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor working in Vienna. He noticed that women in the maternity ward attended by doctors had a much higher death rate from childbed fever than those attended by midwives. He figured out the horrifying reason: the doctors were going directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without properly washing their hands. Semmelweis insisted on a strict hand-washing policy using a chlorine solution, and the death rate plummeted. He had found the answer. But was he celebrated as a hero? No. He was mocked, ridiculed, and driven out of the medical community. His colleagues were insulted by the suggestion that their gentlemanly hands could carry death. Semmelweis died in a mental asylum, a broken man years before his ideas were finally vindicated by the work of Pasteur and Koch. Historians still debate this chaotic interim period, this messy, overlapping time where the age of Mummies was ending but the age of true scientific medicine had yet to fully convince the public. When one great superstition dies, it often creates a vacuum that is quickly filled by new, more modern-sounding forms of quackery. The late 19th century was the golden age of patent medicines and snake oil salesmen, who used the language of science to sell useless, often dangerous, concoctions to a public that was halfway between the old world and the new. The real breakthrough, the magic bullet that would finally deliver on the promise that Mummies never could, came like many great discoveries by accident. In 1928, a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming returned from a holiday to find a mess in his lab. One of his petri dishes, where he was growing bacteria, had been contaminated by a common mold. But around the mold, there was a clear, empty circle where the bacteria had been completely wiped out. The mold, a strain of penicillium, was producing a substance that killed bacteria. He called it penicillin. This was the true wonder drug. It wasn't born of superstition or ghoulish logic, but of observation and scientific chance. It took another decade and a team of brilliant scientists to figure out how to mass-produce it. But by World War II, this new medicine was saving millions of lives from infections that would have been a death sentence just a generation earlier. So tonight, as you settle into bed, maybe you feel a little tickle in your throat. Think for a moment about the choice. 200 years ago, your only hope might have been a gritty, brown powder of uncertain and unsettling origin. Tonight, you live in a world of clean, white pills of molecules designed with breathtaking precision to target a specific, known enemy. The ancient fear of sickness is the same, but our response to it has been transformed. We have, at long last, found a real magic. So let's say a final goodnight to the pharaohs, and be very, very thankful that they are resting peacefully in museums, and not in our medicine cabinets. The story is over now. The last words fade, and the world of candlelit apothecaries and sun-scorched Egyptian tombs begins to recede, like a shoreline shrinking in the distance. The characters we met, the desperate patient, the grim-faced apothecary, the mummy hunter, the society hostess, all dissolve back into the quiet dust of history. The hum of your fan, which a moment ago might have been the whisper of wind across the deserts, and is just a soft, steady sound in the darkness of your room. Let the details of the story soften and blur. The sharp edges of the narrative are melting now, becoming a gentle, hazy landscape in your mind. The clatter and chaos of the Venetian docks, the unnerving silence of the ancient tomb, the murmur of the unwrapping party, they are all just echoes now, growing fainter and fainter, carried away on the slow, deep current of your breathing. There is nothing left to learn, nothing left to analyze. The journey is complete. The only thing that remains is the gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of your own chest, a quiet testament to the simple, miraculous fact of being alive and well in this moment. The shadows in the corner of your room are no longer filled with ancient phantoms, but with a deep and inviting stillness. Let the last remnants of the tale drift away like smoke. There is no need to hold on to them. Your mind is quiet now. The stage is empty. All that is left is the soft weight of your blanket, the cool touch of the pillow, and the gentle pull of sleep. Let the quiet carry you. Let the darkness be a soft, warm cloak. There is nothing left to do but drift. The end of the article. Good night.